Hello, welcome to Science Talk, and my guest today is a retired professor who will introduce himself because has such a diverse, career in his life. So I am gonna let him speak on his own behalf, how he introduced himself, and I think that's more appropriate instead of me introducing him. But let me welcome retired professor Dr. Eliot Jacobson. He has been talking about a lot of stuff related to climate change. I don't want to reveal too much in the beginning, but Professor, thank you and welcome to Science Talk.
Thank you for inviting me to be on your show. Much appreciated.
Absolutely. So let's start the conversation from who you are and how's your life and what are you doing after your retired life?
So, I was a professor of mathematics at a smaller university in Ohio for about 15 years. I managed to get a position as a visiting associate professor at UC Santa Barbara. We just got a couple Nobels, so very proud of our local UCSB. I was in their computer science department as a visiting associate for a couple of years, and then I got hired as a lecturer, just a teaching position, which was really what I wanted because I was pursuing a career in the casino industry at the time. And so I could sort of have two careers. And after I built my casino career up to a certain level where I could just go independent, in about 2009, I left UC Santa Barbara. Had about 8 years or so as a consultant to the casino industry internationally. I mean, anything you say I did, from marketing to game design to working with surveillance to figuring out how to beat every game in a casino in as many ways as possible. Um, Got three books out of that, retired in 2017, and I'm looking for ways to sort of volunteer, things to do. When COVID came around, I decided it was a good time to start a YouTube channel on climate. And I've just been going with the climate narrative pretty much for the last 5 years.
Awesome. So somebody would who's listening right now would be thinking how a mathematics and computer science professor and a casino guy got into climate.
Well, I mean, I've been interested in this my whole life. I grew up in the 1970s, sort of came of age, as a teenager, and that was the peak of the environmental movement, really in the history of modern civilization. There's never been as much accomplished as there was in the 1970s. And so, I was part of that. I went to Earth Day in 1977 and saw Timothy Leary at UC Davis, and this was my childhood, and certainly very depressed when Ronald Reagan came around, and so it was always in the back of my mind. I had kids, I had a career, and all those things, but pretty much my whole life, I've been either directly or indirectly associated with environmentalism. So I mean, it was very natural for me, and I started paying attention to sort of this climate doom narrative. You remember the OK Boomer thing that came around, right? So
Yes.
I was actually had a TV show locally on our public TV where I was interviewing young people about their beliefs, and I called it cross-generational conversations. And I asked this one young lady, this was probably 2018. I asked her, where did she see herself in 15 years? And she said, well, she didn't think civilization would still exist in 15 years. And that was my first sort of in your face doomer that I met.
Mhm.
And that got me very curious about why she would say such a thing. And I really started investigating that side of it, roughly 2018-ish. And so, that's sort of how this modern iteration of myself came into be.
So would you say before we get into climate doomerism and climate emergency and climate alarmism, like would you say was it more depressing at the Reagan's time or like is it more depressing now in 2024 and 2025?
Well, you have to understand what it was like in 1981 when Reagan came in. We had just gone through a decade of incredible progress environmentally. The Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, EPA, all of these getting rid of lead and on and on and on. There's a dozen, 2 dozen great, huge earth-shaking changes environmentally in this country during that time. And then, Reagan came in and he removed the solar panels from the White House, and he said, "You've seen one redwood, you've seen them all," or something to that effect. That's not an exact quote. And so, the right turn, the incongruity at that moment in time was profound. I mean, we honestly, this has felt more like a slow drip drip because we've had the whole COP, going on every year, and we've seen the promises made and the promises not kept. And um, yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that climate is more obviously deteriorating now than it was then. But politically, I think that was the hardest time in my life.
So, so I would start asking you to define, what is a doomer. But I think you've been on a climate chat with Dan Miller a year ago, and that video has gone good amount of reaction and also like good amount of views. By keeping in view, like there's not many serious audience on these hardcore scientific topics we find. But as Dan said, maybe a cat video may see a 50 million views, but if a climate scientist is like kind of putting a report that may not receive a 50 views. That's the era we live in. But before we get into doomerism, did you see? I know you posted on X, but like, did you see the landmark report where 160 scientists published past week? I think saying about coral reefs and how that is a tipping point, a first tipping point for climate change. And what do you make of that report?
Well, I absolutely saw that. I posted that to YouTube. I mean, I'm sorry, to Facebook, all my social media. I had people sending that article to me. I mean, it's one of those things you can proclaim we've passed this, but we've sort of already known that we've passed this for a while. I mean, we've had these coral bleaching events going on right now. What they're saying is 80% of coral will be dead by I don't know whether it was 2050 or the end of the century, but they're not saying like right now today everything is dead, the coral reefs are dead. They're just saying that the death of coral reefs is now unstoppable, right? So that's the tipping point. It's important to understand because the communication about this is not something that's happened today, right? This is a tipping point that the chair is falling over. You can't stop it anymore. And that's where we are with coral. So I think that's certainly alarmism, and you see that breakthrough. CNN reported it, and it's actually been a headline that's been in the news, which is sort of striking amid what's going on in the Middle East and with all the other political things internationally to actually have a climate headline break through that noise. So what do I think about it? I think many of these tipping points are inevitable. It's just going to be, when do we call it? It's certainly going to be the case with the AMOC, the circulation, the ocean circulation. It's going to be that way with the Amazon, with Greenland ice, with boreal forests. So, I mean, there's a lot of these tipping points that are coming up, and we could call all of them in the sense that they're inevitable now, given the rate of rise of greenhouse gases, the rate of acceleration of global temperatures. It's not like these things aren't going to happen. Most of them have a trigger point where we say when the planet passes this sort of level of heating, then this tipping point is unavoidable. And so we're sort of passing the first one of those with 1.5 C, although I believe in the report they said it was 1.2 C was the actual tipping point for the coral, right? And we've blown past 1.2 C now, internationally. So, I think there's a few more of these that are going to come before we hit 2.0. So look for this headline to repeat in the near future.
Yeah, so a couple of follow-up questions on that. So why is it important and why is it dangerous, or like kind of such a tipping point about coral reefs, number one. And for ordinary viewers, like who do not understand hardcore science or like how this works and how this is like overall connected with ecological disaster or environmental impacts. So explain that, and then what is the difference between a tipping point and a triggering point? how do we like kind of go about it? I know it's all about the framing and messaging, and these scientists always on the conservative side. And I also wanted to ask, like, why do you think that is the case? But first, before we get into that, like, why is it important, these coral reefs, and everybody's like kind of almost trying to freak out?
Well, I think for the people who are actually living off of the ocean around where there might be coral reefs, this is not news to them, right? This is, if you live in the east coast of Australia, the northeast coast, you know that these events have been happening. So this is not news to people who live in parts of Florida, or where fishermen are going out and they're not able to harvest or get the same quality of return from the ocean that they have, for their livelihoods. But I mean, it's an entire ecosystem that's essentially breaking down. It may be the most single critical ocean ecosystem in terms of the amount of ocean life that depends either directly or indirectly on the coral. So, when you have essentially a large part of the ocean ecosystem now it's dying or it's going to be dead soon. That's worth noting. I think that it's sort of self-explanatory why that is going to be make life of all sorts, not just human life, more difficult for many species. I'm not an expert on coral, so I don't want to go too far into that question. Your question about the difference between a trigger point and a tipping
Tipping point.
point.
Yeah.
I need clarification on what you mean by trigger because I haven't actually aware of that. So maybe you could just give me a little clarification of what you mean
So
there.
like, yeah, like sometime these scientists attribute things. Oh, we know the global temperature is rising because we're emitting too much, CO2, right? So that's like kind of attribution. And then we say like, oh, so it's been like we emitting this much emission, and here what it triggers this event to be happening, like, oh, climate, like kind of flooding or cloud bursting or something. Like they find out, like they pinpoint this was the trigger behind what it happens. And then they say like, oh, that was the tipping point, that was, like the point when we say like there is no like kind of way to stop this, or like, kind of it was inevitable, it has to happen, and now it happened. That's what we were, like kind of warning you about, and now it has arrived. So like how these things correlate when a scientist frame that, oh, these are the triggering points, or these are triggers, and these are like the tipping points. Because a lot of people would say, I don't know what is a tipping point. I don't know what triggers this. Science is too complicated for me. I have other things to worry about. Why do I care about, like these things happening in the deep of the ocean? And I'm living, not off the coast, like, especially like if you're not living close to the coast, you're just like in the Midwest or somewhere. Why do I need to care? And I just want you to like kind of explain a little bit, like, how do we kind of, not like we as scientists, but like people who care about the planet and care about the ecosystem, care about the environment, frame and talk about these things, and how we make sense for like ordinary people.
So, I mean, this is a great question, and it leads into something called attribution science, and there are people now who what they do is they look at events and see the extent to which that event can be correlated with an impact of climate change, with whatever it's going to be, increased sea surface temperatures, increased global temperatures, less Arctic ice, whatever the attribution is. So, I mean, this is a whole area now that has sort of been pioneered in the last few years. From a communication perspective, it's a very dangerous and delicate thing to attribute some change in the climate to a weather event, right?
Yeah.
Because weather events have always happened, and some of them are fairly severe, and they've happened, at that level of severity before climate change. So this is a very delicate question. I don't think it's a good question for communication to mass audience because it's so easily misused, right? This attribution. It's like, how do you know that this hurricane was stronger because of climate change? Well, we know it's stronger because there is more energy in the system because the ocean is hotter, because the atmosphere is hotter, and more energy tends to create stronger storms, right? So, how do we know that the drought is attributable to climate change? Well, as the atmosphere heats up, for every degree Celsius of heating, it can absorb 7% more water vapor on average, and that's an exponential curve. So as the planet heats up, we're going to have droughts happening that are more severe, more prolonged, and happen faster, essentially, right? So these sort of impacts of climate change correlate with events that are happening. And it's a very delicate balance to say, well, that correlation also involves causation, to some extent. And so I'm going to leave it to those climate scientists who are dedicated to that question, to really go into that. And I think their work is fantastic. Good for them that they're doing this. But it's also one of the attack points for climate denialists, and so I think it's good information in general for other scientists who understand the science, who know that this is valid work, but it's not necessarily good mass communication information. And
Absolutely.
you can actually see that sort of feedback happening, whenever these things get published. There is that feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. So, before we talk more, like you just said like a few minutes ago that you met a climate doomer a few years ago, and that was your first interaction face to face with another climate doomer, and you like kind of claim yourself or self-proclaimed climate doomer and explain for the audience. You may have explained that 10 million times on your website, on other podcasts, but like just for the audience, explain what is a climate doomer, who climate doomer is, and what they believe, and also how was your journey since then, since you met that person, and how it has evolved over time.
So I think this is always a great question to try and answer. What is a doomer? I always quote Sam Mitchell, who has a YouTube channel called Collapse Chronicles, whenever it comes to being asked this question, which is he will say something generically like, if you ask 12 doomers to define doomer, they'll give you 13 different answers. And that's how it is with me too. I mean, I've written an essay on being a doomer. It's on my website, climatecasino.net, where I kind of describe what doomer means to me. But I recently also have been looking at this very question, what is a doomer? And have traced back doomers. I mean, you can trace them back to the book of Revelations, if you like, in the Bible. Thomas Malthus was a doomer, James Lovelock, Paul Ehrlich were doomers. The idea that humans are temporary on this planet, that civilization is transient, is as old as human civilization itself. And so the only change is that this is backed up by science, that this is based on my particular sort of mathematical scientific bent towards doomerism, as opposed to somebody who might be a population doomer like William Rees, right, who sees the overuse of the planet and the fact that we're using 1.7 Earths per year for on average per human. So we're using far more than the Earth can replace, and eventually that's going to lead to collapse. You have, William Catton, who wrote the book Overshoot, where he described in very specific terms how the population will eventually collapse, how civilization will eventually collapse. So, this is not a new thing to me. There are many different takes on what it means to be a doomer. My particular brand of doomer is I am a data person. I come from a background of mathematics, computer science, and risk in my casino life, right? So I understand probabilities, especially. And so my brand of doomerism is not about making predictions. It's not about saying this will happen by then and humans will be extinct, or that there's going to be a huge die-off of humans by 2040, or civilization's going to collapse by 2030. My brand of doomer is to just track on a day-to-day basis what's actually happening with the data that is available to me to track it and to provide that to people, along with science that is out there, like you brought up earlier, for example, with the coral, to present that to people, right? And one of the other things I do, since you mentioned my daily postings, is I do a daily doom quote, right?
Yes, yes.
Where I am quoting, I'm not quoting from some small fraction of climate books that happen to be on. I'm taking the mainstream climate books day after day after day, whether it's written by Bill McKibben, or I'm looking at my library to remember the names, Merchants of Doubt, or whatever the book is. These are mainstream books on climate, right? Where you see over and over and over again people sort of saying that there's this thing that needs to change
Mhm.
in civilization and how we are as humans all over the planet. And if this thing doesn't change, then we're doomed, right? And it's not changing. It's absolutely not changing. When the Paris Agreement was written,
Mhm.
I believe the idea was that we needed to decrease CO2 by roughly 6 to 7% per year in
Yeah.
order to stay under 1.5. That number, because we haven't, is now like 20% per year or something like that. And there are people who will argue that we're already above 1.5 now because last year was. And, my own mathematical predictions puts us crossing 1.5 in late 2026, early 27. So, this sort of aspiration that civilization will come to its senses at some point and do the things it needs to do to not collapse
Mhm.
just seems so naive given everything we've seen from humans, you know. And I say that everything we've seen from humans since Ronald Reagan got elected, since Margaret Thatcher became prime minister, that was the change point, sort of politically.
So you said a lot in that. So is that idea, because I'm also like kind of thinking that you mentioned the Bible references, and I'm a Muslim by faith, and I'm thinking like, oh, there's an idea in the religion that the world is gonna end one day, and this is like kind of inevitable, and the day is not fixed. There are some indications, but it's not like it's gonna be 2100 or 2500. There is no certain absolute time frame, but there are certain indications that if this happens, it's gonna be inevitable. I'm just kind of curious to hear, like, is the idea of doomerism um, coming from religious philosophies or scriptures? Does it trace back to those scriptures saying that the humans or other kind of creatures are on this planet for temporary, and they're not for here forever, and it's gonna end one day and it's gonna be a collapse, but when, there's no time frame for that.
Well, I'm sure for some people, they are religious doomers, and you can just take, for example, this expectation that the rapture was going to happen, sometime in September, I guess, and then October 8th. I mean, the rapture essentially is doom, right? It's everybody who's left behind is doomed, and then there's all of these events after that that are supposed to take place. So I'm sure that for some people, maybe the largest fraction of doomers are religious doomers, in some sense. But that's in no way the kind of doomer I think of as myself. You mentioned your faith. I'm an atheist, right? I have no religious beliefs whatsoever. And so, it just is tangential, but I think it makes the point that this doomer philosophy has so many different manifestations, right? And I tend to focus on the ones that are science-based, or at least
Data
based
based.
in something tangible in the world. But that doesn't discredit the fact that humans as a species tend to have these doom scenarios. I mean, dating back as long as there's been humans. I mean, there's some sense in which we want to know the end of the story, right? And this is a story that's been written for thousands of years, and we'd like to know how it ends. And the only way we could ever know how it ends is if it ends during our lifetime,
True.
right?
True.
So that's the like we really hope it ends during our lifetime so we can know how it ends. I mean that's a cynical perspective. But these doomsday cults, for example, that the guy Jones and who poisoned all of his people, or this cult that was waiting for some space aliens to come and whisk them away, right? These are doomsday cults,
Mhm.
and that is a huge thing for people. One could argue that certain blocks of certain major religions are in fact doomsday cults,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. True.
Um, so yeah, but for me, that's not the flavor of doomer I look at for myself at all.
Yeah, so I because I was also like before this conversation, I was watching there's a Deutsche Welle DW German TV documentary of a German guy. He's also a climate doomer and living in a very silo space where he doesn't meet other people, but like kind of more growing it his own, vegetables and eating and like kind of that level, as you said, the doomerism is there out there too. People are living the life like that. So, like on the climate, especially climate doomers, there are reports every month, every year. There's like thousands of organizations from, sea level rise to flooding to, Antarctica and glaciers melting and heating and all that. Reports are coming every month, every year from IPCC to, United Nations to like all those organizations. For somebody like ordinary people, like it's so much information coming out, so much data we know that how this ecosystem is changing. How do you interpret these reports? Like, how do you read them? How do you make sense of these reports as a doomer?
So one of the interesting things is that I'm often ahead of those reports
Hmm?
because I'm tracking the data on a
Okay.
daily basis. And so I put out the information and then 2 or 3 days later, or a week or 2 weeks later, like the fact that September was the third hottest on record. So I wrote that on my social media on August 2nd. After September's data came in, I said September was the hottest, September third hottest in the last 120,000 years. And then that was a headline a week later because the international organizations, had made that same statement. So, I would say that when you ask that question, how do I react to these things? I react to them sort of like, okay, so now that information is getting noticed.
Mhm.
I've already tried to say that, right? But the other thing is that there's a lot of information that's not getting noticed
Mhm.
that really is sort of the critical information.
Mhm.
And there is this sense in which I wish that we could just focus on 2 or 3 things, like rather than 40 or 50 things. Algae blooms off the coast of Australia is a huge issue, right? All these plants, right? There's this huge heat wave in the North Pacific right now that's creating havoc for weather systems. The Antarctic krill are crashing, right? I mean, there's so many individual things
Yes.
that you just wish that we could just say, okay, what is the actual barometer by
Mhm.
which we sort of put all of these things together
Yeah.
and present, and here's where we are, right? And unfortunately, that barometer has become the global temperature, right? This 1.5. And that's just not sufficient in so many ways because the the way things happen is not linear. It's not like we go from 1.4 to 1.5 to
One six.
1.6. And,
Yeah.
and when ecosystems crash, they aren't recovering.
Mhm.
And getting those things sort of thrown at us all the time from all different directions. Now, this ecosystem, now that one, the coral reefs, everything. It is too much information.
Mhm.
You're exactly right about that. So, how do I personally deal with all of this information coming in?
Mhm.
That's why I try and post these things every single day.
Mhm.
I am reading all of the news. I used to wake up at 3:30 and do this. Now I wake up about 5 to 5:30 and do this. I go through every news article I can find
Mhm.
and try and find that article that has sort of the most severe event, report, analysis, whatever, of the day so in the last 24 hours, and post that. Because that's, if people are only going to read one thing, let's give them the right thing to read so they're not being flooded with
Yeah,
all this
because
stuff.
it's like literally too much. Because people are, they have life, they have, like jobs, and they have other things to worry about, and then all sort of information is coming from different sources, and it's hard to get your head around most of the time. Especially it's just hardcore scientific information. A lot of people are not literate on, climate, health, science, literacy, in terms of how to make sense of that. But there was a new again talking about a new report, like there were also the amber report, right, saying that we it's like amber, EMBER, I think it's from England, saying that this is a great news. What is the great news is that we have surpassed, that we are producing more energy from solar and wind and geothermal than fossil fuel. Look at that, we are phasing out from fossil fuel, right? We are transitioning. There's more energy, like California 100% renewable, Kenya 93% renewable, like many other countries, and these examples. What do you make of these, and like how do you see these transitions, like when we talk about, because whenever you talk with the climate scientists, the first thing they say, you have to phase out from fossil fuel. We cannot rely on fossil fuel. That's the number one thing. The rest of the things are secondary, but the primary thing is that you have to phase out from fossil fuel. Stop burning more coal and gas and these things. So is this a good thing? Is it like we're transitioning to renewable energy? Or are we going to have in 50 years, in 100 years, then we're gonna get rid of these coal, windmills and these solar panels, and let's move to something new?
So, I mean, it's a big question you asked, but let me go back to the first part of that, which is this report, because I read that and I actually got in a bit of trouble on Facebook when I responded to this report. And my response was, what they're talking about is electricity.
Mhm.
They're not talking about total energy. And when you look at the total energy picture, including cars that are that are on the road and ships and airplanes and factories and total energy, then in fact CO2 is at or near its record rate of growth right now. So the fossil fuel generation of greenhouse gases is as fast as it's ever been in the history of humans producing these gases. The actual peak was in 2019, and then in the aftermath of COVID, it kind of fell. And so I watched this statistic on a multi-year track, and because I want to make sure that we sort of balance out all of these short-term effects. And we are right back at a peak. And in fact, it's already been documented that 2024 saw the highest release of greenhouse gases of CO2 ever, right, as a year. So I think it's a very disingenuous report. It makes it sound as though we have accomplished something when we haven't accomplished that. Simply generating more electricity is not the same as cutting fossil fuel use, right? And yes, there is more electricity, and there are times of the day in certain locations on the planet where essentially the all of the electric need is being covered by renewables, and some climate scientists like to make great fanfare out of that fact. And yes, that's even happened here in California. Meanwhile, there's millions of people driving their fossil fuel cars on the road that are not being accounted for in that equation, right? So, so we just have to be careful with understanding this. And the other problem with all of this, in terms of a long-term future, is that these technologies also degrade the environment, right? You talk about we have to end fossil fuels, right? But in fact, what we have to do is end the destruction of the environment. That's what we have to do. And this whole notion that we can replace one thing that destroys the environment with another thing that destroys the environment, but that second thing is less destructive, is absolutely anti-environmental, right? environmentalists, at least the ones I grew up with in the 1970s, they chained themselves to the tree, right? They lived in that tree. They did not want that thing to be built that destroyed that ecosystem. And now, you have China essentially covering over entire valleys with solar panels.
Yeah.
And that being applauded by, the global environmental movement, that China is destroying vast ecosystems, to go solar. Well, good for them, they're going solar, but bad for them that they're destroying ecosystems. So, my belief is that environmentalism has completely lost its way in this, and it no longer is about saving the environment. What environmentalism has become is how can we prolong the slow death of this civilization, right? For the
It's
longest
more of
possible time.
it's more of you saying, if I interpret correctly, like you're saying it's a lesser of two evils. That we are saying that we are saving ourselves as a humans from the catastrophes of climate change, and then these windmills and these solar panels and these energy systems are going to save us, if not forever, but at least for longer period of time.
Well, I mean, they'll prolong collapse, but then they will make it more severe when it happens, right? So this is the Seneca cliff idea that we're going to go off the cliff sooner or later, and
So majority of go
it would
ahead.
be best to go off the cliff in a controlled fashion rather than to continue to find new ways to destroy the planet. I mean, for me, I would much prefer we not destroy anything new environmentally anywhere, right?
So how do we do that?
Well, collapse is going to happen sooner or later, right? So what a doomer would argue is it's better to have controlled collapse, and some would call it degrowth. The way to collapse is unfortunately it's not going to happen, right? In a controlled fashion, would require incredibly draconian measures, limiting travel, limiting foods, limiting, all use of fossil fuel for heating and cooling, limiting the products that we can buy. Essentially, you have to say what is absolutely necessary for human life. All right. Do we need to travel to see our grandparents? No. Right? Do we need to watch television? No. Do we need to eat processed foods? No. I mean, and everything that's not necessary has to go away. That's the only way to avoid this cliff.
So what
This
is the
sort
possibility of degrowth? What is the possibility? Because humans, are more on this planet than ever before, and it's continuing more than 8 billion people, and we're not seeing any like kind of tangible actions that it's going to slow down, maybe in some parts of the world, but like not in many parts of the world. That we are going to have more humans, we are going to have more consumption, hyper more, ultra processed everything, because we are destroying the environment. There is no agriculture being left. It's everything is corporate sector, right? Mass production of things, because we're consuming more, right? So how do we like go not consuming things and have minimalist and more of, kind of, I don't need another pair of shoes, I don't need another shirt, I don't need another laptop, I don't need a new iPhone every year, like all those things as an individual level. But then on the other hand, when you see these reports, it's like, oh, only 97 companies are responsible for 70% of, the global emissions or heating. And then like ordinary people would say like, oh, look at that, like what my iPhone is going to do when, like, one company is polluting more than, 100 billion people or something like that.
Yeah, I mean that's the tragedy of the commons right there. It's like, why should I do it when, I unless everybody does it, it doesn't help, and so why am I sacrificing myself when all these other people aren't doing it? Yeah, so I mean, really, what you've done is just highlight why collapse is inevitable, why a very difficult and we're starting to see more and more sort of this fascist. element taking over, and this is certainly one of the elements of collapse as we get, for example, more people needing to flee from parts of the planet that are no longer habitable because of temperature or storms or whatever. The ecosystem's been degraded, so they can't grow food, whatever it is. We're going to have more emigration, right? More people looking for another home, which means we're going to have more closed borders. We're going to have more reactionary governments,
Yes.
that are anti-immigrant. We're going to have more, sort of internal political battles because of that, because there's people who side with the immigrants and people who don't, and so you have more internal tension, more civil wars, So this is what's coming, right? When you look at the United States and say, oh, this is, a one-off because we have this guy who has these political views that are very extreme, that's a one-off. No, that is the inevitable consequence of climate change. And we see this same movement in other countries, right? This movement of international banks to sort of give up their climate, policies that they have. These movements in Germany or UK or Australia that are anti-green. This is what's a natural progression. These are not somehow a temporary aberration, and then we're going to get back on, the wagon figuring this thing out. Um, this is going to get worse,
Yeah.
right? And it's going to continue to get worse and continue to get more authoritarian, because power is going to defend itself, and we are what's being used is human capital in this battle. So
Resources.
I don't know. I don't have the least bit of optimism, and I don't have the least way of describing a path that will avoid the worst case scenario.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think when I talked a week, 3 weeks ago with Dr. Peter Kalmus, you may have heard or known
oh
him.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And he was saying that I asked him, what is one thing, I'm going to ask you later as well. What is the one thing we should be talking as a society and we're not talking about it related to climate change? And he said that I wish climate scientists and people who care about the planet talk more about the rise of fascism and authoritarianism and how it is relates to overall ecological disaster and calamities. And because as you said, there's going to be a lot of internal and external conflicts because it's about resources, it's about capital, it's about humans and migration because of these catastrophes. So one of the things is that how we do we need to declare, like, I mean, we means like as countries or societies, do they need to declare climate emergency? Is it going to fix the problem? Because a lot of people talk about, including Peter Kalmas, he said, like, I wrote op-ed and letters to a lot of letters to Joe Biden asking him to declare climate emergency, but they didn't. So is it like short term, long term solution? Is it a solution at all? Or like how do we, and what are the thresholds that we say like, okay, these criteria are met, now we are going to declare climate emergency?
So I think Antonio Guterres has already declared a climate emergency, right? I mean, he has used every metaphor he can
We can
think of, from the oceans are boiling to the ticking time bomb to, I mean, every metaphor that he can come up with, he's used, and you could write a dictionary of metaphors, climate metaphors, just based on his own language, his own way of communicating. So, I mean, if not him, I mean, who else has the power to put it in place? Because it needs to be international. It doesn't matter what we as a country here in the U.S. do if this is not an international, decision. And there are enough people who understand the sort of the full scope of what would need to change and have spelled that out. And we all you have to do is look for the "we need to" or "we must" or "we have to" kind of languaging to see how often sort of solutions have been put out there that would work if the big we actually could do any of this stuff. But there is no big we. I mean, we have Vladimir Putin, we have Donald Trump, we have a bunch of we have China, we have India, we have Indonesia, Brazil, we have countries that are autonomous, free thinking countries that are going to go their own way on these things. And, we don't have the power to just tell Biden to declare a climate emergency, and suddenly that climate emergency is going to mean, okay, no more driving a la COVID. The freeways are empty, right? No more flying. You can only shop on every third day or something. Whatever it is. And the thing is that if you read these climate books, the ones that are sort of solution oriented, whether it's Catherine Hayhoe or Dana Fisher, just the ones they're saying we have a solution, that solution is so transparently impossible over and over again. For example, Catherine Hayhoe, she wrote this book, Saving Us, where the solution was we just have to learn how to talk to each other to really explain so everybody understands what the climate crisis is. Then, we'll have a big kumbaya moment and suddenly we'll be taking the right actions. Or Dana Fisher, she has this idea, what is it called? The anthro shift. Her idea is the anthro shift. And the idea is that there's going to be some climate shock at some point, right? Maybe it's some heat wave in India where 1 million people die. What is that book? Kim Stanley Robinson wrote the book Ministry of the Future, right? In that book, where it opens with this huge heat wave that kills millions of people in India. Are we going to have an event like that? Yes. Is that event going to suddenly change sort of the consciousness of all the humans on the planet? And so there's this anthro shift so that now we'll actually do the things we need to do, right? Well, it might change some people in India. And the way that book progressed, if you actually read that book, is that what India did in response was geoengineering, right? So okay, they didn't actually change lifestyles. They just tried to physically change the climate by pumping sulfates into the atmosphere.
Yeah, Prof, I don't think so. I honestly disagree based on looking at the actions. Action speaks louder than words. Back in
You
Pakistan,
you
2015.
disagree with me, or you
No, no, no.
disagree?
I disagree with those ideas that like if there's gonna be a big shock. I mean, I look at the wars in the world right now. There were two active wars over the last 3 years. How many people it has changed, and what actions did we take to prevent in the future? And I mean that shows the picture because I remember 2013, 2015, 10 years ago, almost 2,000 people died in Pakistan due to heat wave in one single city.
Well, you had 2022, you had that flood, right? Didn't you have like
Exactly. Oh,
30
not in
million people?
2025 again. 2025 again. Like literally, it was like 40% of the country was underwater.
Right.
40% of the country. What did
Yeah.
we do? Nothing. We just
Right.
came
So
at the UNGA General Assembly and throw some words and shake our hands and go back. So,
yeah.
so yeah, as you were saying, that like these independent countries, and I wanted to ask. Recently, there was a United Nations General Assembly meeting, at the United Nations in New York City, where thousands and thousands of people fly over, contributing more to emissions, and then they come here, and majority of them it didn't even talk about climate change. So, what do we expect from these leaders and from independent countries to do something about climate change when they do not even talk about it, at the United Nations General Assembly?
you're asking me questions where I think we kind of know.
Mhm.
Maybe you're a doomer too. I just look at things like, you know, there is this whole Just Stop Oil movement in the UK, right?
Yes.
About,
Mhm.
you know, and any oil that they didn't, they decided that any progress that was made there, Norway has stepped in and said, okay, we're gonna, get all that oil, so I mean the idea that we're going to leave wealth untouched,
Mhm.
like, oh, there's all this money right here and we can just grab it and take it, for ourselves, for our country, for whatever. Oh, but no, we shouldn't do that, is it's not sort of compatible with how the history of countries and nations has evolved, right? We are plunderers by design, right? If you have it, I want it.
Yeah,
It's going to make my people more likely to survive,
absolutely.
this sort of tribal idea. So um, I don't see, I mean, these things are good for their feel good. You know, we can make the big speeches, we can have the meetings that show solidarity on the cause. You know, but what is the action? Well, if the action is we are going to approve more windmills, approve more solar, you know, ease export restrictions on solar panels, we're going to fund reparations for, you know, Africa, climate funds to help. Well, you know what? I mean, this is one of the things that about this whole idea that of climate justice, and I'm sure you know a lot about this topic. But I mean, one of the things that's always struck me about this is it's not like these third world countries that are suffering the, you know, by and large, the effects of climate change. It's not like they just want money so that they can build infrastructure. They really want a lifestyle that's equal to ours,
Yes.
right? They say, well, you have all these things. We
Yes.
should have those things
Yes.
too, right? This
Yeah.
is, you know, how could you just think that somehow by the grace of God you live in a place that has resources and we don't,
Yeah.
that you're entitled to all that, right? So climate justice means this sort of equalizing
Yeah.
of lifestyles, which is where deep growth comes in, right? Because the whole idea is, well, we will lower our standard here and ship out the excess to, you know, third world to bring them up, and we can equalize. I mean, just the implied growth of these societies through the building of infrastructure and energy imports, you know, and what is the country? Is it Guyana? Am I even saying that right? That they just recently discovered huge oil reserves, and you know the government there is like pledged to not open these oil reserves
Oh,
because because of its commitment to climate,
climate.
you
Yeah.
know. And you know that's a one-off.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely. So so I just want to talk a little bit about the, solution oriented or policy thing. What is the doomer narrative proposed for policy changes? What kind of policies do we need? Maybe like we already have too many policies, that's itself a problem, or do you think the way we approach even overall policy making process is kind of not the way it should be?
again, quite a question you asked there. What is the doomer perspective on policy? I would say that we are in a predicament. We are not in a situation where there is a problem. Problems have solutions, predicaments have outcomes. So understanding that we're in a predicament and there will be outcomes means that policy should be directed towards understanding the outcomes and mitigating the suffering and displacement associated with those, not just human, but all life, whether, you know, whatever the life is in the area that's being impacted. So, you know, even for coral, I mean, a doomer might say, well, we should be investing in seeing if we could genetically engineer heat resistant coral that we can replant in these, you know, these areas that have been destroyed. And there are some, you know, there is some research into doing exactly that sort of thing. So I would not prescribe any policy, you know, personally, whose primary purpose is to prolong civilization. So for me personally, I am not only anti-fossil fuel, I'm also anti-wind, anti-solar. I am anti-all energy, right? And so if you are against energy, you know, then the result of that is collapse because you're simply not able to continue to build the infrastructure to support a growing population. So, you know, the consequence of sort of being anti energy is pro collapse.
So
Um,
is it I want to ask, I am trying to ask everybody, every one of my guests about AI. It's a hype, it's a buzzword, it's everywhere. And I like to describe that as, early 2000 or early 90s or 80s when we had internet, and we thought, oh, it's gonna revolutionize the world. Of course it did in many different positive and negative ways. Same with social media. It brings a lot of good things, but a lot of bad things, misinformation, disinformation, what is real, what is not real. That new debate, fact checking, all of those things. Now AI is there, and these big tech corporations are pumping billions of dollars into this new thing they are promising, that it's shiny, it's great, it's gonna change the world, and it's gonna save humanity, civilization. There are people who are talking about, ethics and building more human AI and more humanly possible AI for good. Where do you stand when it comes to artificial intelligence?
I use it all the time. So AI uses energy, right? It uses electricity especially. And there is this idea of Jevons paradox that you may be familiar with. And, a brief description is that an increase in efficiency of any resource generation does not lead to a decrease in the use of that resource. So when we have more electricity, it doesn't mean that we're going to have fewer fossil fuel cars. It means we're going to find another way to use that electricity, right? And I mean, we're just seeing this over and over again, that this Jevons paradox play out with all of the solar and wind generated electricity that's coming in. We have these data centers, we have AI,
Yeah.
huge consumers, and we're never going to catch up. There's never going to be a day that says, oh, now we finally have enough uses for this stuff and we can start replacing fossil fuel energy with this other energy, and which goes back to one of the earlier questions. So all that means is that as long as civilization is growing, right, I'm not going to take a stand and say, well, this is my line in the sand. Civilization has grown too much. I'm no longer going to use this, that, or the other technology because it's past the line in the sand for what I consider civilization should be, right? And so I make full use of AI all the time. I've tested it for coding, and it can replicate some of the codes that I used to do when I was a casino consultant. I was writing code for casino games. So it's a very powerful tool, and I see it impacting all manner of life to benefit civilization in the short run. In the long run, the resource depletion is going to accelerate and worsen collapse.
Absolutely.
So that's certainly also, the downside of it. So,
I'd say it's,
someone,
it's a trade-off. It's kind of trade-off. Like, do you want to be part of that, or you want to exclude yourself from these things? And regardless, it continues.
well, yeah, and there's always going to be something else, the next, like you say, the next pretty thing that comes along. I think that one of the problems with AI is this idea of AI slop. Um,
Yes.
so, for example, if I want to find something with a Google search now, I essentially can't find original sources because there's been so many AI generated versions of something similar, and those have somehow migrated to the top of the search window. So, it's hard to find things
It
now,
is.
and this is really accelerated. And when I started posting these daily moments of doom, a few years ago, I would go onto Google search in the morning and I could type in climate crisis into the search engine, and down would come, Reuters and Financial Times, and New York Times and Washington Post, right? And I could look through mainstream media articles and find something. And now what I get are these weird domain names that don't even make sense. They're like random letters, right? And they just lead you nowhere. They lead you to stories that don't have an author. They just have the story there. Sometimes at the bottom you will say, some of this content has been generated,
Right.
through
Yeah.
technology. They don't tell you which technology, right? So, there are tremendous near-term downsides to this technology as well. I have published a couple of articles on my blog that are AI generated, and there's a lot of pushback for that. One of the recent ones I just published was I published an article called The 15 Types of Doomers. And I already had in my mind a list of individuals and books. And so I gave AI a prompt that was quite lengthy that included these individuals and this data and stuff. And it wrote this essay, right? And I went through it, and corrected it and changed it and reorganized it. But essentially, it saved me hours and hours and hours of work.
Yeah.
I would have written the same thing. It said exactly what I wanted to say, right?
Yeah,
So
so I think it's time to wrap things up. So what is I'm gonna ask you that question too. What is something that as a society we are not talking about and we should be talking or spending more time talking about when it comes to ecological disaster, or it can be about doomerism, it can be about climate change, environment, it can be any of those things.
I think that one of the key things about being a doomer is this idea of alarm and fear,
Mhm.
right? That those are the things that draw attention.
Yes.
And I would really like to see, as a doomer,
Mhm.
that this perspective not be mocked by mainstream climate scientists. You know, you have a book that was recently written by Genevieve Gunther, right? The Language of Climate
Yes.
Politics,
Yes.
that opens on page 10 attacking doomers. You have Hannah Ritchie attacking doomers. You have Michael Mann, you have Catherine Hale, you have all of this anti-doomer sort of propaganda out there. I think this perspective that civilization is collapsing in real time and we are witnessing it, we are here witnessing it,
Mhm.
right? This is not fear. This is not attempting to alarm people. This is saying, here are the facts. The coral reefs are dying, right? We passed a tipping point. The Arctic just hit its thinnest point ever recorded in the month of August. You know, here are facts over and over again. Let's stop lying about where we're heading. Civilization is collapsing, and allowing that to become mainstream. And believe me, these people talk about it behind closed doors. They
Yeah.
know, you know,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
allowing this to become a mainstream conversation, I think would do have tremendous healing impact for the sorts of conversations we could have with each other. Not saying that we're only allowed to talk about this half of the bell curve and the other half of the bell curve, oh, that's off limits,
Mhm.
that you can't talk about
Yeah.
those events, even though, they're as probable or more probable than the half you are allowed to talk about. So for me, the biggest change I would say is in sort of this taboo
Mhm.
against this fact science believed view of the future by mainstream climate scientists and media. It is really important as far as allowing the conversation to take place in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we have to leave it there, Professor Eliot. Thank you so much for your time. It was a wonderful discussion, and I hope that people would like it and also give their feedback in a more constructive and positive way of what we have discussed today. Thank you so much.